All right, I am Jesse Weiler, the director of the Liturgical Institute, here representing the Institute on Religious Life, and I am talking to Abbot Austin Murphy, who is the abbot at St. Procopius Abbey in Lisle, Illinois. Abbot, how are you today?
Hello, how you doing?
I'm great. How are you?
Good, good.
Abbott, I have some questions for you. We've had conversations about this in recent days about how there's mutual enrichment between monastic life and the domestic church. And I think
Mhm.
this is a really important thing to be discussing, especially right now, because a lot of us in America, are quarantined, and it's almost like we're cloistered domestic church. And I want to talk to you about how the monastic life can help me as the abbot of my own domestic church get through this time, and but
Yeah.
also do so in a way that is faith filled. So first off, I would like to just right off the bat, what are some ideas or some of the theology behind how the monastic life actually informs the domestic church?
Yeah, yeah, there's a lot here, and there's a lot of, I think, ideas out there about structures. So that's what I really want to focus on is this idea that structures, sometimes we can think of them as observances. They help us in our spiritual lives. The challenge, I think, in many ways, we have a bias against structures in our culture. So you see it in one example now is kind of this outlook that's sometimes called spiritual but not religious.
Oh, I hear that all
Uh,
the time.
Yeah, and so the religious is kind of identified with structures, especially religious structures, organizational structures, and it's seen as to genuine spirituality. And so, what I found in my experience being called to monastic life is it's just not true. It's not. It doesn't hold up. And so, on the one hand, there's this real value of structures, but at the same time, I realized in my own faith journey, and I think many people know this, that structures aren't the end all, though. And that's one of the key things that they're really valuable. They help a lot, and they're even necessary in a certain sense. But they're not the end all. So what we're really working on is a genuine, authentic spirituality. And I like to think of that in terms of the virtues, which we could perhaps talk about what that
Mm-hmm.
means to speak of a virtue. But yes, that's the question. How do you kind of dedicate yourself or apply rather structures in such a way that they're really cultivating virtues? And that's been a kind of a puzzle for me, and I've been thinking about it. And yeah, I think it has a lot to offer for domestic church for anyone in their faith journey. So yeah, I think it's very important. I have a definition of structures that I think
Let's hear it.
helps.
Let's hear that.
Okay, so it's as I said, it's like an observance, but I would say it this way: it's something. A structure is something directing you to do something, right? So it's a directive, but it's observable in two senses. So it's observable in the sense that you can observe or follow what it's telling you to do. So, for example, a speed limit is telling you to drive under a certain speed, miles per hour. And then the second way it's observable is that you can observe or notice whether or not you followed it. So, like if I'm driving 40 in a 35-mile-per-hour speed limit zone, then I'm not following it. I can see that.
You're
So
probably
structures have
you're
these.
probably still safe though, I think.
Yeah, that's right. It is a little autobiographical. I do have the reputation to be a little bit heavy on the pedals. So, um, yeah. So if you have a observance telling you what to do, and then you can see whether or not you did it. Those two things. So if you think about it, there are so many structures in human life, and once you really let it sink in that definition, you see it's just human to have structures that guide us and help us in so many things. Just to give secular examples, so to speak, or ones that aren't specific to religious life, the speed limit again. If you're following a recipe and what to make, it's a
Mm-hmm.
structure. If you're following a diet regimen, it's a structure. If you're workout routines, right? If I'm going to go jogging every day or every other day, that's a structure. It's telling you what to do. Jog this, every day or every other day, and you can see whether you did it. Um, strategic plans or structures, even an organizational structure we talk about, or governance structure. How are decisions going to be made? Is that process then followed? You can see whether or not you followed the procedure. So structure is so much a part of our lives, and I don't know. I just find it very fascinating to think about, and it does help us in our spiritual life with virtues. And I would even say God has used them. by giving us, for example, the sacraments.
Absolutely.
But I'm throwing a lot out there. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. Hmm. Yeah. 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 No, that's it's great. I would say there's this is interesting because the tradition itself, and I'm thinking especially of the monastic tradition, has identified. So the monastic life is very structured in many ways, but it has identified ways in which structures can be misused, and so it knows the pitfalls. It knows that there are some, and so it identifies these as one would be where especially in religious life, would be you apply a structure and it makes you look good, right? So, like one might be, for example, you're going to church every Sunday. That's we should be doing that. But
Mm-hmm.
then you can start thinking kind of in a puffed up way, like, look at me, I'm doing these things, and so it can become pharisaical, holier than thou, hypocritical even, right? So there's a structures, So when giving example, Jesus' own teaching, right? We read it at the beginning of Lent. When you fast, when you give alms, when you um, when you pray, right? So all these things can be considered in a structural way. I mean, prayer is a virtue itself, but the
Mm-hmm.
structures of prayer are talking about, right? So Jesus is saying, when you do these things, right? So he's not saying don't do them, but he knows that when you do them, there's a danger. You're going to do it for show.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of a form of deception. You think either to yourself or you're trying to prove to others, if not both, that you're better than you really are. So it takes the focus off growing in virtue to kind of a sham, false representation of yourself as being so great. So that's one way, and the monks, the ancient monks, knew this. The other way I've noticed is attachment. People can get attached to their structures, and the example I think about is I think pretty common when one becomes very serious about their faith. They might do something like fasting, or they might find a certain kind of prayer they like to recite, and then they stick to it no matter what. So fasting, for example, when I was younger, I could fast more. As I get older, I just don't have
Right.
the ability. So if I were to stick to things I did in the past now, it wouldn't be prudent, which is a virtue, and it wouldn't really help. So, but if we're, let's say, like fasting, we have a good experience. We experience a kind of I think sometimes like spiritual freedom in a way where we've kind of practiced a little detachment. And so it can be, we associate then that the structure, the practice of fasting in a certain way with that spiritual consolation, and then we get attached to it.
Mm-hmm.
And so we stop looking at how the structure is really helping us grow in virtue. So we have to keep the focus, in my mind, the key is keeping the focus on virtue. Because virtue, it's not God, or virtues are not God, but virtues are the way to God.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a kind of also a traditional teaching that we do these outward things, so to speak, these structural things to grow in virtue. And then virtue is not the end all either. It's not the final point. Virtue is a path that brings us closer and closer to God as we
I
practice them.
think that's an amazing point, and I'm just gonna tweak that a little bit because, and I think
Sure.
it's even more prudent because even let's say fasting or almsgiving in and of itself, I've never done within the confines that I have right now. So I've never fasted in a scenario where I'm stuck inside for 2-3 weeks at a time. So we're
Yeah.
fasting. We're doing in my mind. I know this is kind of a cop out, but in my mind, it's like, well, I mean, we're all fasting right now. It's like forced fast right now. So do I really need to
Yeah.
be so rigid about,
Mhm.
Fridays, or rigid about, Lenten promises or things because of the scenario that's popped up? And so
Yep.
the thing I would really advise people is to not let this be a point where you just kind of lay off the pedal, but maybe in a way, it's even better if you take this as an opportunity to adjust your mentality about what fasting is. So don't let fasting fit into your lifestyle, but let your lifestyle fit into your fasting. And I think that would be such an amazing
Yeah.
step forward. The next place I want to go to is prayer. And
Yeah.
and right now, especially with a lot of Americans not being able to go to mass, so I can't go to mass on Sunday. I couldn't go yesterday for the solemnity. Uh,
Yeah.
it's looking like Easter is not going to happen the way that it usually does either. So, how can we use the monastic tradition and style of prayer to inform what we do in the domestic church?
Yeah. Yeah. That's great. It's a real challenge. And so, and I, still in contact with different people, phone calls, other things, and yeah, you hear about this. Yeah, one way in which and people have, as we know, live streaming to mass and participating in a remote but genuine way as much as possible. Of course, not be able to receive, but so there's different things like that Eucharist. But one thing that comes to mind is just in the monastic tradition we call it a horarium. It's just what it means is a schedule of times. So it's a schedule. That's we like having fancy
Yeah, that's a fancy word.
Latin words that they sound cool and we like to use them and keep them. But it's basically a schedule. So there's a motto for Benedictines that our life is pray and work, pray
Hmm.
and work. And so you have times of prayer, punctuate the day, and then you have work periods. And sometimes we joke it's actually pray and eat because after our prayer times we often go to eat too,
That's
but then you
something
go
I
work.
can sign up for sure.
So but this idea of a schedule is so important. So I would really, really recommend that you keep some schedule, one that works for you. And if you're at your home, you have kids, you have other issues, you have to juggle. It's not like you have all adults who can all go to the same time of prayer, but you can still put in some structure, schedule that has a time for common prayer together, that has a meal time, and then there's time to do your work. And the prayer, especially that can be done, is the liturgy of the hours, and the various
Hmm.
resources for praying that are digitally available. But if you're also if you have a print uh, version, they use that too. So the liturgy of the hours is especially good for that because that's what we do at the monastery. It punctuates the day, sanctifies the day, brings us back. I mean, I have, if we get time later, I have like 4 ways, I think, structures cultivate virtues. And I think the liturgy of the hours, as well as the Mass, um, they do all. I mean, I probably should think this through more, but I think they do all of them.
Hmm.
It's kind of, again, the sacramental life, the liturgical life that God has given to the church is it shows the wisdom, I think, of how structures are supposed to be used.
Hmm. Absolutely. And in the liturgical institute, we have one of our courses a whole section on liturgical time, and I think obviously you know all of this, but I find it really fascinating how the liturgy of the hours lines up and synchronizes with the Lord's Passion. So
Yeah,
especially during Lent,
yeah,
that's a really good
yeah,
time to start a tradition like that in your domestic
yeah,
church or your family, because then that can kind of bleed into the rest of the year. And that kind of
yeah,
brings me to my next point is, how can we take these ideas that you've expressed and we've had a dialogue about, how can we
mhm,
use that as a jumping off point to add structure to our life beyond this state of life where we're all quarantined? How can we make our lives look like that beyond just being cloistered together?
yeah, yeah. I think it helps to really focus on kind of structures in certain areas. So we've already talked about prayer, and so that is having, let's say, you're not quarantined, you have more outside kind of things going on you have to juggle. So one way it can help sometimes is I sometimes tell people like the first thing after rule, if you will. So like the first thing I do after I wake up, the first thing I do after breakfast, the first thing I do after supper, whatever it is, that can be a point of kind of a certain break already in your schedule in your day. Do some prayer before you do anything else. Because what happens,
Mm-hmm.
at least for me, if I start doing something else, it's like forget about it. My mind's already gone, and I'm racing down that way.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to stop and do certain things like get a meal. Sometimes we do it on the run, but
I'm
still,
sensing a food theme again with all of
yeah,
this.
pretty neat. That's right. Yeah, sorry. Um, so yeah, but there's things like that. So you would it sometimes helps if you make it the first thing after something that's already scheduled in your day, then you can slip it in, and it becomes so that's with prayer. I do think again, expand the meal thing. As monks, we eat together. We have certain might be considered odd practices like not talking while we have a meal. We have table reading going on. Someone's reading from a book that we're listening to. Right, so that might not work. It might, maybe for part of the meal in a domestic church. But meals are very important. As we all know, it's something that's been eroded under the pressures of modern life with eating on the run, everyone having their own schedules
Mm-hmm.
of, whether it's sports, other extracurricular stuff, whatever, the kids have. And there's no consideration for pausing and having family time or very little. So it's really a juggle, but meals together is so important, I would say. That'd be another area. Prayer time together. It could be a family rosary. It could be, praying Compline together. But having a meal, at least one meal together, really, I think would be another thing that you can build in as a structure in your life. I think the other area I would kind of focus on is, there's really so much. I think of different schemes in my mind, but some of the monks talk about basically they talk about spiritual knowledge,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and what they kind of mean, as far as I could tell, it's a little bit of a fluid idea, but the knowledge of spiritual things. So you know what it means to live a moral life, a virtuous life, and all of us, I don't care how advanced you are in theology or philosophy, that's something we got to keep on nourishing and thinking about and meditating on. And so that means having access to good authors. Saint Benedict, towards the end of his rule, tells his monks, read, Orthodox authors, these fathers of the church and so forth. So, so you have to keep nourishing your knowledge and the way you think. One of the early monastic authors talks about it as your mind is kind of like a grist mill. It's like turning stuff in it all the time. And what is the kind of what are you going to put in that grist mill? Are you going to put in good wheat
Mm-hmm.
for it to produce good bread, the food of understanding, as well? I'm coming back to meals again.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, but it's imagery of the grist mill. But you could put like chaff. It's not going to nourish you.
Mm-hmm.
And we know this. We have there's so much input from whether it's streaming programs, other kind of media, right? So it's really important to find time in our schedule and find resources that are going to put good wheat into that grist mill. And I think it's worth structuring that.
Mm-hmm.
Whether I'll give an example that's fallen out of use for many monasteries actually, although I think it's not a good thing overall. But one of the things that used to be read at certain parts of the day as a community, for example, at a meal, would be the lives of the saints. And so just like read whose feast day is that day, whose memorial. And so that's not a bad practice. So it might be at the end of a meal for a family to read the life of a saint. You learn a lot. Actually, you learn a lot about history even too.
Mm-hmm.
But you learn a lot about spirituality. Or you might pick, you might have a good devotional book that has nice daily meditations that you read together as a family, and it just got to put some good stuff in your head so it can turn it into spiritual knowledge, so to speak.
Yeah, to bring it back to food one last time, I did see a tweet the other day that said, "Are we following regular meal schedules, or are we all just on airport schedules right now?" Meaning, like you could have just eaten breakfast, but when you're at an airport, you're like, I might as well eat, and then you're like, well, I'm getting on a 5-hour flight, so I better eat again before I get on the plane. So the last
Yep.
thing I want to discuss is this idea of monastic silence, and I think this is really fascinating because we live. You just mentioned it. People are live streaming conversations across the state lines and things like that, like we are now. But we are flooded with content still, and I think this is a good opportunity for
Yeah.
people to understand the role that silence plays in our lives. And if you could just speak to that idea of monastic silence and how that can inform, like somebody like me in the domestic church.
Yeah. No, good point. Yeah, I mean, ultimately, there's the tradition, or just I think everyone talks about exterior silence versus interior silence. When you structure it, you're going to be structuring exterior silence, but that's crucial. You really need that in order to cultivate the interior silence. You need times of that. They are distinct, and yes, just like any structure, you can falsify pretty much any structure, right? You can go to mass every week for the wrong reasons and not, spiritually
Mm-hmm.
benefit from it. That's possible, right? So you can falsify exterior silence and not use it for the right reason. You might be doing it because you're just a crank and you don't like to, leave me alone, whatever. But still, if you want to cultivate interior silence as a virtue, this kind of attentiveness to God and then to what God is doing in the world around you, as well as your life, you got to have that exterior silence. So scheduling, moments of no talking uh, is really good. I mean, it's very important. And Saint Benedict says that monks should be cultivating silence at all times. But he then adds, especially at these times. So he wants a general spirit of silence, but he's going to then say we're going to do it especially, he'd say, at the nighttime, for example, or during a reading period, or while we're eating meals, we're going to be silent. And in that case, probably listening
I
to
don't think I don't think he had two
something else.
toddlers running around the house, but
No, yeah, that's
but
right.
it's still important.
Yeah, so good
It's
luck.
important for them to
You can
understand
tell me
this
how
as
well that.
it's important for them to understand this as well.
Yeah, yeah. And I don't know. I mean, this is kind of, you can tell me more. I imagine you might be able to do it, and this is going to depend on how well your children respond to it, I imagine too. But just like a teacher in a classroom for little kids can sometimes say, okay, we're going to be silent for 10 minutes or something like that. You don't push it too far. You're not,
Hmm.
yeah, but you might be able to find some way of little experience of silence, perhaps make it a game. Um, I don't know. I imagine something like that could be done, but I'm not a parent, so I don't speak from experience.
I think, from my experience, I think it's good to kind of get that stuff started and just do things little at a time. I mean, if I could get my kids to just be quiet, do like silent prayer to themselves, maybe for 5 minutes, I think that would be, for where I'm at right now, a huge victory. Or you know what I
Yeah,
mean? To just be at a point where we can say, hey, my oldest 4 year old, her name is Agnes. Agnes, we're going to pray to ourselves for about 5 minutes, nothing out loud. But I want you to think about this one thing, or I want you to think about your grandparents or your siblings or things like that. And I think
yeah,
that would go a long way to help her understand
yeah,
silence, rather than what we tend to do, especially nowadays, is just we try to just fill the void, and because it can be
yeah,
uncomfortable to be silent for that long. So, well,
yeah.
Abbott, this was an amazing conversation. I really hope to be able to do more of these conversations in the future. And if you're available, I would love to pick your brain more about how I can take some of the things that you do in the Abbey and help what I'm doing here in the home. So thank you very much for your
Sure.
time. God bless.
Yeah. Well, thank you. God bless.